Okay, great. Well, I think folks can keep joining, and I hope folks will keep joining, but we can kick it off here. Good to see you all. My name is Andrew Sirota. I'm head of research at the Office of Eric Schmidt, where I lead our work on AI and democratic innovation. It's been a real joy for me to be able to moderate a few conversations that Claudia, Semi, and others have been leading around really insightful papers that they've been contributing over the past while. These are papers that are thinking about the interaction between AI, technology, democracy, and democratic deliberation broadly. For one, have really appreciated the papers. I think they do a really nice job at forcing us to kind of zoom out a little bit and question our assumptions, or to force us to articulate or re-articulate our reasons for wanting to integrate technology into democratic processes in the first place. I think for those who have been following along, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is our third paper launch at the AI and democracy intersection. The first was the five dimensions of scale paper, which, my understanding is really getting at the what. What do we mean when we say that we want to scale deliberation? The second one was more focused on the how with scaling catalysts. And now we have perhaps the most important one, which is the why. When we say we want more deliberation and we want to use technology to scale it, why are we doing it and what are we actually trying to achieve there? And in a sense, we can think about democracy as a decision-making process, but the core question of this paper is it more than that? And what does democracy do to the citizens who are involved? And what do those kind of intrinsic experiences of being a democratic citizen, how do they change or how should they change when we think about the ways in which we integrate technology into those experiences and those exercises? So with that, I would love to just introduce our three out of four authors of the paper. We are missing Yoram today, but he was very instrumental to the paper and sending him our best. So we have Claudia, Sammy, and Eugene here. Just to quickly introduce them, I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with their work. Otherwise, you likely wouldn't be here. But Claudia Schwalitz is the founder and CEO of Democracy Next. And Claudia established and led the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation from 2018 to 2022. And for those of you that are familiar with the OECD's work during that time, you will know about the kind of landmark papers that Claudia helped authors, such as coining the term the deliberative wave and all of those kinds of things that have been so foundational to the field more broadly. Sammy McKinney is an AI and deliberation fellow at Democracy Next and also a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Together with Aviv and Kyle from the AI and Democracy Foundation, Claudia and Sammy also co-lead the Deliberation and Technology, or DelibTech network, which I'm very happy to be a part of. And then Eugenie is the Impact Research Fellow at Democracy Next. We're super pleased to have them here with us to present their paper. Just to, before I hand it over, maybe some quick scene setters for what to expect for the next roughly, I guess, less than 90 minutes now. But it's split roughly into thirds. So the first third will be the presentation from our co-authors here. The second third we'll hear from our wonderful panelists who I'll introduce after the presentation, just to give some initial reflections and to get our conversation kicked off here. And then we're reserving the final 30 minutes for questions from me and hopefully from all of you. In my experience moderating these things, there are always far more questions than we can get to, but they're always so rich. And so I would really encourage people to participate. We have a Q&A function. That's the easiest way for me to be able to track different questions that are popping around. Sometimes the chat, when it's a really good conversation and a really provocative one, the chat can become overwhelming. But please feel free to leave any comments wherever you wish. This session will be recorded and uploaded afterward. And I believe that's it for now. If anyone has not yet had access to the paper, please let us know in the chat and we can repost it there. And otherwise, Claudia, off to you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. It's always nice working with you on these events, and welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for being here. We've been looking forward to this and are very excited to the conversation. I'm going to share my screen to bring up a few slides, and Sammy and I will go over the presentation together. Eugene will join in the discussion, and unfortunately, Yorm couldn't be here today, but sends his apologies, and his colleague Samir is here. So if people do have any questions, he can answer them in the chat as well. Without further ado, I'll jump into things. Before I get into the presentation of the paper itself, for those who might not be as familiar with Democracy Next, for context, we are a research and action institute focused on broadening who has power and improving how we make decisions together in government, but also other organizations like schools and universities, museums, workplaces, banks, pension funds, all sorts of other organizations, on the basis of three principles that underpin deliberative assemblies. Sortition, meaning randomly selecting decision makers, deliberation, which we will talk at length about today, and rotation of power. So let me now get into it. In a context of democracy under strain, one promising response is deliberative democratic innovations. We have well over 1,000 examples of them in government, but also beyond in other kinds of organizations like I was mentioning. And the research shows us that they can help to depolarize opinion, generate well-reasoned policy recommendations, help to build trust, reconnect people to political life. However, they are also resource-intensive, slow, and difficult to scale. The growth of LLMs has led to interest in how this new wave of AI might contribute to addressing these challenges, and this is what we mean when we refer to AI. The pitch has been that AI can make deliberation cheaper, faster, more accessible, and more scalable. We argue that when designed with care and intentionality, AI can play a powerful role in strengthening the goals of deliberation. However, the catch is that the very efficiencies that make AI attractive to deliberative practice risk undermining those goals. So in this paper, we hope to make three contributions to the wider debate around these questions. The first is that we argue that one of the most important virtues of deliberative assemblies is that they build deliberative muscles. Secondly, we offer a typology of 7 deliberative muscles, and we map out where AI integration can either strengthen or weaken those muscles. Third, we argue that strong muscles contribute to the civic societal capacity that resilient democracy requires. Our overarching argument is that DelibTech should strengthen and not weaken citizens' deliberative capacities. Now, why do deliberative muscles matter? Strong deliberative muscles are helpful to citizens at an individual level, but there are also collective societal benefits of having a citizenry with strong deliberation muscles. We argue that this is essential, though it's not the only thing that's needed for bolstering democratic resilience. In a democratic climate that's increasingly defined by polarization, manipulation, and hostility, deliberative assemblies create unique spaces that allow people to cultivate skills at the heart of democratic practice. Reason-giving, listening, self-reflection, curiosity, sitting with disagreement, updating one's views in light of new information, imagining new possibilities, moving from individual preference to shared judgment. These are all skills that require practice. They atrophy when they aren't exercised, and taken together, practicing them can help awaken or strengthen people's sense of agency, the feeling that they can indeed shape their future and influence change. This reframes what deliberative assemblies are doing. They're not just about producing recommendations, they are also cultivating citizens. This is the angle from which we examine deliberative technology. Not, does this tool produce a better recommendation faster? But does this tool leave people more or less capable of deliberating well? That is the key question.
So to provide a scaffolding for thinking through this key question that Claudia just posed, we draw on a distinction by David Krakauer between complementary and competitive cognitive artifacts. An artifact is complementary when it sustains or enhances our capacity to perform a given skill. An artifact is competitive when it degrades our capacity to perform it. As an example, if we learn mental arithmetic using an abacus, and the abacus is then taken away, our mental arithmetic skills are likely to persist. So this is a classic complementary use of technology. Then if we learn arithmetic using a calculator, and the calculator is taken away, the skill is likely to be far less developed. So this is a competitive use. An important nuance here is, of course, that a tool may be cognitively competitive, but at the same time open up new skills. So a calculator may make us worse at mental arithmetic, but opens up higher order reasoning skills. Therefore, we emphasize the central importance of context. The same application will have different trade-offs and consequences depending on how it is used and the setting into which it is integrated. And so to help us think through what kinds of artifacts are likely to be competitive and what kinds of artifacts are likely to be complementary within deliberative settings, we draw on emerging literature on cognitive debt. And this research shows that the various ways in which our cognitive skills, such as problem solving and critical thinking, the various ways that technology intersects with them can actually atrophy our skills when we outsource too much to technology, and that large language models and other forms of AI are actually exacerbating this trend. So this kind of cognitive debt is something that we very much want to avoid within our deliberative spaces. So with AI capabilities proliferating, we see the temptation of people turning to competitive cognitive tools. This might make deliberation seem or easier, cheaper, and remove some of the friction and hard work. But the crucial question is, at what cost does this come? And the muscle lens that we introduced in this paper aims to help commissioners, facilitators, and technologists to ask and also hopefully answer this question with more precision, and also gives us a framework for critiquing some competitive uses of AI that are receiving increasing attention and publicity. So, for example, some of the proposals for AI's role in deliberation appear clearly competitive, such as artificial societies, which use AI personas to replicate real-world attitudes, beliefs, and opinions, cutting out human interaction altogether. If quick recommendations were the only thing of value, some would see this as an improvement. But the muscle lens helps us explain why it is not. Synthetic population learns nothing, listens to no one, and leaves no citizen more capable than before. It completely bypasses the activation of our deliberative muscles and therefore undermines a core aspiration of deliberation and deliberative processes that Claudia was setting out at the start. So what are these 7 deliberative muscles that we outline in this paper, and how could AI be used to both help or hinder them? It's important to note before we dive into that the 7 muscles are not exhaustive. They're generated with the hope to inform concrete design questions and action for technologists and practitioners, and also they map relatively well onto traditional stages of the deliberative process. So this is an overview of the 7 muscles of self-reflection, reasoning, dialogue, vulnerability, collaboration, imagination, and facilitation. In the paper, we explain what each of these are, and for all of them, talk about, give a number of examples of both competitive and complementary artifacts. And so there are some, sorry. So and then we talk about the complementary and competitive versions of each. And then just now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give 2 examples for self-reflection and collaboration. And then for the other ones, I'll just provide an overlay of what they are. So self-reflection is the capacity to examine one's own values and beliefs before and throughout a deliberative exchange. So an example of a competitive use of AI here would be an AI system that tells you what to think or what you should think based on your demographic data or ideological preferences, such as some proposals for digital twins or simulated deliberation that I was talking about a moment ago, and that these uses outsource the work of reflection. But an example of a complementary use within deliberation would be AI applications that help you think through your beliefs, such as plural realities, pre-deliberation prompts, which have been used in Japan. This is a system that does not tell you what to think, but rather it supports you in thinking through your own values. It surfaces tensions in your own thinking, and enables you to have a more considered sense of your perspective both before and throughout a deliberative process. The second deliberative muscle is reasoning, which refers to the capacity to engage with evidence and expertise in a critical and reflective fashion. This is a crucial skill in increasingly polarized and toxic media environments. The third muscle, sorry, is dialogue, which is the capacity to listen attentively, to respond to others, and to provide reasons for one's claims towards collective action. The fourth muscle is vulnerability, or the capacity to bravely share one's own feelings and reflections, to tolerate conflict, and to feel the weight of others' experience. The fifth muscle is collaboration, or the capacity to move from individual reasoning to shared judgment and thereby reach outcomes where collective ownership is felt and experienced. So, competitive use of AI here would be to pass the work of sense making to an AI system, where you give the LLM the transcripts of a deliberative process, and then it passes back what is said, what the main ideas were, and ultimately what the output should be. But there are actually many different ways that AI could be used in a complementary fashion to support collaboration, including AI applications that help visualize the relationship between different perspectives, which is what we can see here in this argument tree from DemBrain. This allows citizens to see how arguments relate to one another by placing more unique arguments at the edges, and arguments that combine topics become more central nodes. This allows citizens to keep track of the different arguments and perspectives that have been shared, whilst also showing how they relate and interact with one another, thereby supporting iterative processes of collaboration rather than replacing it. The sixth muscle is imagination, or the capacity to envisage futures, counterfactuals, and to challenge status quo and dominant logics, which is something that's incredibly important in today's times. And the final muscle is facilitation, or the capacity to guide small group deliberations in productive and inclusive fashions, which we take to be especially important in the times of polarization that we live in today.
Thank you, Sammy. I'm now going to zoom out from the deliberative muscles to share how this relates to the wider societal lens and why investing in civic infrastructure and civic AI is a precondition for democratic resilience. The vision is that an increasing proliferation of deliberative assemblies in which citizens have an opportunity to exercise and cultivate their deliberative muscles creates a virtuous cycle of capacity building. As these practices spread, we have the potential to bolster social cohesion, channel collective intelligence, and strengthen deliberative capacities. This matters for how we think about the technological choices that are at stake. The societal capacity that democratic societies need is built through many individual exercises of these muscles. We offer three considerations related to societal capacity in the paper. First is related to investing in civic infrastructure, which we believe is essential to supporting and sustaining the structures that enable people to strengthen their deliberative muscles. This is in reference to things like training, ensuring there are standards, having ecosystems of good practice. In our previous paper with Sammy on effective scaling catalysts, we dived deeper into the evidence on this. Second is that if deliberative practice becomes deeply dependent on AI infrastructure, then shocks to that infrastructure becomes shocks to democratic practice. We also draw a bit on Audrey Tang's work. As she's argued, there's a difference between treating data as oil, which is drilled and extractive, and soil, which is tilled, tended. If we build civic infrastructure for data, training, and evaluations that any community can use, the tacit knowledge of facilitators, care workers, and the people a community already trusts become the soil models grow in, rather than something that's extracted and lost. So civic AI isn't just a hedge against shock and geopolitical risk. It's a precondition for this virtuous cycle. Human capacity is what makes the soil fertile in the first place. And third, the lens of efficiency or scale is too narrow. We must ask what tools leave participants, facilitators, and the wider institutional ecosystem more capable at the end of the process than at the start.
Thanks, Gloria. And also towards the end of the paper, we tried to map out three future trajectories for how the deliberative muscles approach can be further developed. So the first is exploring and measuring how different process designs affect the cultivation of deliberative muscles. So we know that assemblies are not a monolithic thing. There's a very broad space, design space here, and they can operate at many different scales. So we need to develop metrics for measuring these muscles, study them in relation to this variations in process design, and this will hopefully give us a fuller picture of how different processes can be combined in fruitful ways to address the various democratic deficits and challenges that we face. The second future trajectory is communication guidance about using AI in deliberative processes. So it's a recurring challenge for practitioners to communicate effectively and transparency around AI use. So we think the deliberative muscles approach, by showing how tech can be used in muscle building rather than muscle hindering ways, can potentially provide a useful lens and vocabulary for overcoming some of these challenges. And the third future trajectory is exploring the political economy dimensions of AI and deliberation and how this affects deliberative muscle cultivation. So we think if the deliberative muscle lens is to be realized to its fullest potential, it must be put in dialogue with questions of AI ownership, infrastructure, and democratization, as Claudia was just mentioning. This is something that we're certainly excited to explore more, and we think will be very synergistic with the deliberative muscle lens.
Thanks, Sammy. In conclusion, then, we have argued that strong deliberative muscles are essential for navigating nuance and complexity, productively engaging with pluralism and divergent views, and cultivating empathy and civic love. Qualities which are largely missing in electoral politics and many decision-making contexts today, and which are needed for a democratically resilient society. Deliberative assemblies are valuable not only for their outputs, but for what they enhance in the people who take part in them, individually and collectively. AI integration that prioritizes efficiency over capacity building risks hollowing out a key ingredient that makes deliberation worthwhile. As Wittgenstein said, we have got onto slippery ice where there is no friction, and so, in a certain sense, the conditions are ideal. But also, just because of that, we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction. Back to the rough ground. An essential design question is whether and how to use AI such that people leave as more capable deliberators. We've identified in this paper 7 dimensions that can lead to either strengthening or weakening people's deliberative muscles. There's therefore a role for human agency in deciding which of those pathways gets taken. We argue that practitioners should resist easy efficiency gains that bypass hard work and human capacity building. Public actors should invest in and develop digital public infrastructure and civic AI that bolsters trust and distributes power. Technologists should reflect upon how the technologies they develop could strengthen and not weaken people's deliberative capacities. Scholars should support the mapping of deliberative muscles and how technology affects their cultivation. And communities and civil society should demand and design deliberative processes that sustain and strengthen people's deliberative muscles. But these are not all challenges that are put just to individuals. These are structural pressures and therefore also require systemic change and support, which is why we also focused on the investment needed in civic infrastructure and civic AI if we are to enable the conditions that make deliberative technology worth using at all. These considerations are relevant for everywhere that deliberation takes place. So in governments, but also workplaces, schools, cultural, and other institutions of daily life. Efforts across all these multifaceted domains will support us in navigating one of the most pressing challenges facing humanity: building a world where technological innovation and democratic innovation work in harmony. Back to the rough ground. Another democratic future is possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claudia and Sammy. Back to the rough ground. I really like that. I haven't heard that before. Okay, we are a few minutes ahead of schedule, which rarely happens. And I will also say that I have a bunch of questions for myself, from myself, for both the presenters and for the discussants to come. This is supposed to be an exercise in collective intelligence, though, and I only see one question in the Q&A, which is also very rare. So I would encourage everyone, if you had provocations or things that come up that you would want to put on the table, please be encouraged to do so. I'll now turn to our 3 other panelists, whom we are very lucky to have joining us. Lisa, sorry, Lisa, Maggie, and Mauricio. I'll introduce all three of them first, and then go in that order. They'll have about 7 minutes, 7, 8 minutes to give their reflections on the paper. So to start with Lisa Gudermuth is a senior program officer with the Mozilla Foundation Incubator, where her work focuses on identifying and supporting technologies that give power back to people and communities. She's currently managing Mozilla Foundation's Democracy and AI cohort, which had some very exciting news yesterday, I believe, which she will share. Mackie Hughes is the CEO and co-founder of Convoca, a civic technology organization building infrastructure for relational civic life. She recently completed her PhD at the MIT Center for Constructive Communication. And Mauricio Mejia is based in Mexico City, where he collaborates with civil society organizations across Latin America to promote sortition as an alternative to party-based representation and citizens' assemblies as deliberative models to enrich collective decision making. So with that, maybe I'll start with you, Lisa. When we were chatting about this, something that stood out to me was that you described yourself as someone relatively new to the deliberative tech space, and I realized that everyone joining this call may be approaching these questions and these topics from very different vantage points. And so I'm curious from your perspective in as a funder, as someone who engages with policymakers, what stood out to you about this paper? In particular, would love to hear your reflections on the AI and democracy cohort at Mozilla. And I see our first question in the chat from Wendy was asking about just like a bit more of an articulation of what kinds of deliberative technologies we're talking about here. Is it just Polis? It's definitely not just Polis, and so I know that within the call for proposals and the projects ultimately selected, there were a wide range of different kinds of deliberative technology. So if you could speak to that, that would be a great place to kick off.
Wonderful. Thank you. That sets me up perfectly. So again, hello everyone. I'm Lisa Gudermuth, Senior Program Officer with the Mozilla Foundation Incubator. And as Andrew mentioned, we just announced our Democracy and AI cohort yesterday, which is a cohort of technical projects that are meant to serve as the proof points that AI can be intentionally built to be in service of democracy. And as a reviewer on this paper, I said as much in the review process, but it would have been great to have this paper at the outset of the call for proposals. It's really distilled a lot of what we instinctively knew and had learned through the process, but didn't have a framework built out like this to use as a guide. So I really want to emphasize, as a relative newcomer to the space, I think this paper is really written in a way. It's informative, but it's really meant to be, whether you're funder, policymaker, or practitioner, and we'll hear from others on the panel, to be able to really make decisions about what is complementary and competitive, or what direction you can build in, and also like for funders like myself to determine what is a helpful application, what's valuable to the ecosystem. So what I want to talk about is some of the things that we were thinking through during the call for proposals process, and how it kind of matches up with some of the things that were written in the paper. And also to the question, I wanted to talk about 3 of the projects within the cohort of 10 are deliberative projects. So I'll try to highlight some of them. And then I also want to talk about a little bit about infrastructure and next steps. So for context, in alignment with the Mozilla Foundation belief that better tech futures are possible, we in the incubator program have been assembling a cohort of technical projects that, again, are meant to serve as the proof points that AI can be intentionally built to be in service of democracy. So we've awarded 10 projects with $50,000, and they'll also have support through the incubator program to bring them from promising prototype to a sustainable project. And some of the things that we were kind of like the rules that we were kind of like rule of thumb that we were trying to kind of use as we were evaluating different projects in the deliberation space, especially, but even actually more broadly, are tools that help us become more informed, skilled, and engaged in the democratic processes that affect our lives. So, and especially supports rather than replacements, centering human judgment and decision making. And so, like in the intro, Sammy mentioned a project that kind of exemplifies what we were not looking for, which is something that kind of tries to agents that mimic how we might engage as individuals and kind of just take care of democracy for us. No, like we were looking for things that help us better engage in democratic practices. Um, so so just to talk about a few of the projects in the cohort, I actually I felt a bit scooped, Sammy. I'm gonna talk about plural reality as well. And just to also say, Democracy Next did not know what the cohort of projects were, and I did not know that these projects were going to be referenced in the paper. So I think it speaks volumes about the projects themselves that they were highlighted in both spaces as examples to look to of technology applications of AI in service of democracy. So just to say plural reality, their project is by Soku Kaigi, which again addresses the self-reflection muscle. And it was built in response to rural Japanese villages facing population decline and needing to make collective decisions about consolidating infrastructure or cutting services, like really tough decisions. And it helps the community to understand their own positions before deliberation, turning their concerns into structured democratic input and enabling bottom-up democratic legitimacy. So it's a tool that exemplifies, I think, supporting or strengthening the self-reflection muscle. And I also want to call out about plural reality and Shutaro, who's part of the team there. He's done a lot of blog posts about, I would say, about the self-reflection muscle. And I think what's helpful, what was helpful or interesting to me was that beyond the kind of strictly deliberative democracy spaces, it's also a muscle that can be applied to even organizational spaces where people come to the table, of course, with their instincts or their views, but could be better prepared in reflecting on what are actually their perspectives and what are the values that underpin them and how can I articulate them effectively in a group. So just to say there. And then another project in the cohort is Metagov with their open facilitation library. And it's intended to define and teach what good facilitation looks like. So even in that short description, you can see that it's a supportive or a complementary tool in the facilitation muscle. And then another project is actually Convoca, which I will say very little about here because we're going to hear from Maggie just after I close, who is the CEO of Convoca, I believe. So I think what I'll just say now with the rest of my time is one of the things that I was pleased to see addressed in the paper was the societal aspect to sustain deliberative muscles, and our AI infrastructure that we rely on is a big part of that. And so the way I've been kind of putting it or thinking about it is it's fantastic if we map out both how to effectively build and use AI in service of democracy, but how far does that get us if it's all still built on democratic stack? So this is something that we as Mozilla have been talking about and will continue working on through our grant making. So things like open source AI or small fit for purpose models that organizations can build and train. And it's also something that at the very beginning of the call for proposals process, when we were just having conversations with digital democracy organizations, they were just, how do you use and engage with AI tools thus far? It was definitely one of the things that they had expressed to us is like transparency and agency as core tenets of democracy. And so that should be embedded also in the infrastructure that underpins it. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Maggie.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Yeah, Maggie, big congratulations on being selected. You are coming to this paper and these topics from a perspective of being a builder, a technologist. And so I was wondering if you could walk us through, as you're actually thinking through design principles and like the process of making a product or a technology come to life, what are the considerations that are going through your mind that are mentioned in the paper and also more broadly?
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks, Lisa, also for the overview. And thank you for the congratulations as well, Andrew. Very excited for and really looking forward to this cohort. So excited to be a part of it and excited to be along with all the other projects. Yeah, so I think, and just to say, so Convoca is co-founded with Emily Lynn and Cassandra Overney, and as described, we're really oriented, have an orientation towards building civic muscles or supporting that kind of work and supporting that learning work. So we were really excited to read the paper and see this framework and this overview. And I think just to give some context around who we work with, and then I'll explain how the framework has been helpful for doing some sense making around our work. Right now, we've primarily worked with city leaders, and so urban planners. We've worked with urban planners in New York City, so from that perspective, and then community organizers, both folks who are organizers on the ground in North Carolina and who train organizers in Harvard. And so we're coming out with these two hats of kind of a civic practice from a grassroots perspective, as well from a city and kind of governing perspective. And in both these contexts, we were really lucky to work with folks who are training others and building capacity in others. And so organizers in that way are really oriented towards, let's develop leadership in these folks. Let's develop our ability to identify needs of our community, deliberate together, and then develop strategy informed by that. And the planners that we work with do Elizabeth Hamby and Jasmine Topale and Addison Waters from New York. They do a great deal of work around how do we bring in community members into the planning process and have us do collective sense making together to develop plans. And they're both developing and kind of building civic muscle with the community, but also with their team of planners who are building that capacity to make sense at different neighborhoods at different scales. And so we found this paper really rich and valuable because similarly to Lisa, a lot of the components of the framework resonate with learnings that we have, but hadn't necessarily articulated or been able to, or haven't gone through that process yet. And the naming of the muscles, the 7 muscles, as well as this like competitive complementary analysis, we found really useful in making sense of some of our learnings that is then informing how we're building and moving forward with our work. And so I'll highlight just a couple examples and like anecdotes of those learnings that we've had on the ground and how they map to that framework, and then kind of share some initial insights that I have that might be useful for discussion or for others as well. So the first is how we worked with planners around sense-making processes. So they had large amounts of community voice data, very rich. And we were using AI alongside the planners to say, how do we do sense-making here, which is a very common, or something that we're seeing a lot of these days. And a key finding that we had was that there were some components of the sense making in which AI felt very useful and very important, or like something that could really relieve some work from them in a way that didn't feel like it was atrophying the muscles that they hoped to be building. And so one example is tagging. And so this can tag quite quickly, quite efficiently, in a way that took planners, 40 plus hours of time to do tagging if they were doing without AI support. But then there was some work that they really wanted to isolate or focus on initially in a very collaborative and human way, which was around insight finding and pattern finding within that work. And so that ended up being a very collective process that they did together with the initial AI tagging support. And so we found that I think the context takeaway within the paper was really valuable from our perspective, because we found this like socio-technical context to be important in our space. So they had this social practice of coming together and finding these insights in which they wanted to preserve and bring in AI a bit there, but then the tagging kind of outside of that felt more useful. Another just anecdote is we found we worked both with planners and the community to design our initial system for this New York planning context called Voice Division. And when we worked with the community, something we were really curious about and that the community and the planners were all interested in is how can we get a sense of the full perspectives that we're seeing within this space? And so I do think this speaks a bit to the self-reflection and reasoning and dialogue points within the paper is within this space, we found that the way we present different perspectives and the kind of granularity of our design choices could have a big impact on whether muscles are being built or atrophying. So for example, we had an inclination to say, let's use AI to maybe summarize and say, here are patterns that are like yours, and here are patterns of voices that are different from yours. And interestingly, we ran a randomized control trial on this and said, well, do two things. One where we use AI to summarize in a personalized way, and one where we just say, here are patterns on many different sides. And what we found was that the personalized perspective for some felt very respectful, and for others felt actually agency reducing and patronizing, because we were saying, this is what we heard you say. Is this right? This is what we heard others say. And it led to pretty intense reactions and negative reactions, and ones that felt that they were reducing agency and participation in the process. So yeah, just thinking about we can present both voices in a kind of non-AI interpreted way, and that felt better versus when we had this interpretation, it was felt agency reducing. In the last bit of time, I'll shift towards the organizing context and a couple points there. When we were in the organizing context, we did a similar process. We worked really closely with community organizers in this work. And we'd seen two uses of AI so far that we found particularly interesting that this community might find interesting. And the first is actually around outreach. So if you've ever been a part of like a grassroots campaign and you start to get texts from that campaign all the time around show up to this event or XYZ, one way that we've begun to see organizers experiment with AI is to, rather than just have mass automatic texts go out, have a chatbot that's within and kind of texting and responding. It's a very complex space because I think there's something about that texting that also doesn't feel very relational and doesn't, there's some challenges to that, but it also brings people into the door and then they focus more time once they're in the door. And so we've been having some interesting discussions with organizers around, in their context, what do they choose to prioritize versus sacrifice? And they might sacrifice that initial investment because of their capacity and resources and orient their learning more towards, okay, once they're in the door, we're 100% like relationally with them and present with them. And so that was an interesting finding. And the final one is actually, maybe I'll hold off and we can maybe talk about it more later, but is around coaching around conversations and conversation analysis. And I saw the open facilitation library is also in the cohort, which is exciting. I know there's a lot of folks oriented and thinking around facilitation here. So how AI is used in that space, I think is fascinating. Just some final words and kind of takeaways for me is I think throughout all of this, a reflection that I had reading the paper and engaging with the material is around the social practices that go alongside kind of the individual muscle building. I know we talked about the system level and kind of structural level, so that felt really important. And for folks diving into civic and kind of deliberative muscle building, I think we were really lucky to work with and co-design with people who are dedicated to that, who are trainers and educators and kind of in that space. And we found that knowledge invaluable to designing technology in those spaces. So something to explore. But yeah, I'll pass back to you, Andrew. Thank you for the time.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Yeah, I mean something that strikes me, and there was a comment in the Q&A about this, is the importance of preserving civic space when we think about democratic infrastructure, and so I would love to pull in Mauricio to maybe give some reflections on the role that civil society plays in all of this. Something that really stood out to me when we spoke was maybe the tension between, on the one hand, we and presumably many people on this call, although I hope not exclusively everyone, buy into the premise that AI and technology more broadly can actually be something that enables broader participation and that makes democracy feel more real to more people. And at the same time, AI is quite unpopular, and there is broad and very low trust of the technology. And so I'm wondering at how you think about this in your work and what navigating that tension would look like.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Claudia, Sami, and the rest of them next for the invitation and for the excellent paper. Actually, just say a few words before I jump into answering your question, Andrew. But I really enjoyed the paper, I think, and of course what Lisa and Maggie were saying. But I really find that this paper quite balanced in terms of it doesn't fall into a techno-solutionist or an easy path to promote, the yes for the AI for the sake of AI approach. I think it's quite important. And also the muscles, I think it helped us participation community to promote moving democracy from processes to like culture and to promote long-term investment as education is. So I think it doesn't only, help us navigate AI, but it also help us change the narrative around democracy as something that we need to invest throughout the life of everybody. But I mean, I said it's a balance and I enjoy it because I am usually quite skeptical, but mainly because of how governments will use AI. And I'm scared always because they seem to might sometimes fall into choosing the cheap, the efficient, the easy path of participation. And we know that deliberation and participation is complex. Human decision making are complex processes that sometimes are full of frictions, full of challenges, and we should keep that in mind and not going towards, synthetic, very easy approaches. So just to go back to your question, Andrew, I think I would like to, before addressing the how and the when to use AI, I think there's two main considerations I would like to put on the table. One is around the opacity of the tools and AI in general. You said the lack of trust. I was reading the latest OECD trust survey where only 4 out of 10 respondents actually trust that governments will use AI. So it's not about trusting the technology itself, it's actually trusting how humans and how institutions use AI, which is, I think, a different and important to make the difference. Because at the end of the day, the importance is that we trust the tool because the tool will have an impact on the process, on the outcome. If already we have some troubles, ensuring people trust democracy, trust the process, if we, in addition, we bring technology or a tool that sometimes is understood as a black box because we don't understand it, it's not accountable, it's not transparent. So it can, affect at the end of the day the results of the process and the legitimacy of the process itself. So on that, I mean, of course, I mean, there's plenty, and I saw quickly on the chat, but there's plenty of initiatives looking for better transparency, better public understanding of AI, but also, on democratic governance of this of AI, and I mean the citizen path, also on the global compact. So there are a lot of initiatives towards there, but I think that's something, and also echoing Doreen's comment, the importance of civic space, because if the tool itself is harming the civic space, why would we use it for democracy? And the second cluster of challenges that I wanted to mention before going with some more positive aspect, it's the concentration. And I think that's very important, especially concentration of power, with which, them next and all the people working in the deliberative and participation community, what we're looking at is to actually deconcentrate power and to share power among more and more citizens. So I think there's a contradiction here because today we see that AI development, AI capacities are really concentrated in a few hands, especially in the global north, which creates a certain imbalance and dependency on especially global south countries, not only on technology, on knowledge, on also, extractive relationship between the two regions of the world. And I think we should understand the market as a critical infrastructure. So countries should have this in mind and don't depend on specific companies or specific countries. And in another point related to this concentration and imbalance of power, there's the language exclusion, which I think resonates a lot with the muscle, especially the dialogue muscle, because there are many languages, especially minoritarian, indigenous languages, that do not have the same capacity or development of models like English, Spanish, Mandarin, etc. So I think that if we want, to strengthen the muscle of dialogue, keeping the richness and understanding the complexity, grappling the richness of language is very important to have this muscle developed and enriched. So I think here that we need to invest in more the democratic development of AI, but also ownership, models of governance and ownership that go beyond the Silicon Valley or the one company approach. And maybe to finish, I just wanted to point out to some interesting examples that I think could help me, don't become just the negative and show that there's something happening. And for example, I mean, V Taiwan and Claudia and people in the chat were mentioning both Audrey and Polis, but I think this is a good example that was later used to also inspire, for example, Engage California, that it's a model of hybrid participation that uses AI but keeps the human factor, which I think is very important, or at least I consider a very important factor to keep in to really have this muscle development, this empathy, this social enrichment of deliberation and participation. And more recently, waves developed by demos in the United Kingdom using Camden to talk about care. I think this hybrid use of AI without losing the human touch is very interesting as case studies. And to answer a little bit my own criticism of languages exclusion, for example, the Spanish government initiative to develop with collaboration with the private sector, a model trained in Spanish and also in the other official languages, but treated and understood as a digital critical infrastructure. I think that's a good model that other countries or other regions could go towards. And last but not least, I think the community aspect of communities such as Decidim, for example, could be replicated or could serve as inspiration for other forms of governance and development of AI tools to use in the context, of course, of democracy. And to finish and go back to Audrey Tang and Caroline Green, I was reading yesterday to prepare to this their Civic AI framework, which I think a book is coming up next year. And it's very interesting. If you don't know about it, I really invite you to go and read it because it builds a governance framework, but that it's based on care and ethics. And I think the combination of the two take us to another form of understanding AI, which is more based on the local, on the community, but with accountability loops and with clear responsibilities of who does what, and so then who pays what, which I think it's quite essential to have a positive impact. So that was kind of the things I wanted to share, and thanking again for the invitation, and hopefully to continue this chat here or beyond. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So many threads that we could pull there. And realize we only have 35 minutes left, which I was concerned that there weren't going to be enough questions in the chat, and as usual, there are just far too many, and so many of them are so rich. So thank you all for participating. Um, just quickly, there are some questions in the chat asking for different use cases of instances in which AI has been used for public input and deliberation, and just to expound for a couple more sentences on the V Taiwan example, just because I realize not everyone on the call may be familiar with that. That's sort of like the canonical example that people point to that dates back to starting with the sunflower movement really in 2014. So there's a question in the chat: when we talk about AI, are we only talking about Gen AI? No. There are much earlier examples of simpler machine learning algorithms, such as in Taiwan, that have been used to basically map points of consensus among large groups. So starting in with the Sunflower Movement in 2014, this then led to the Taiwanese government to inviting Audrey Tang, who was a civic hacker at the time, to join the Taiwanese government as what would become the first Ministry of Digital Affairs, and together they built V Taiwan, which is based on the Polis infrastructure, which does this precise thing of allowing thousands of people to comment and respond up and down to other people's comments, and then it uses machine learning to map areas of what Audrey calls the uncommon ground, and that input is then taken and integrated into policymaking, and it's been used on dozens of policy issues in Taiwan, most famously with the introduction of Uber and other things. Okay, so there are so many rich questions here. One thing that maybe we can start with, just from I really loved the paper, and I think there's some good skepticism to be had as well, right? So for anyone who has participated in a deliberative process, it is both energizing and exhausting and draining. And it requires a lot of you cognitively, emotionally. And so one question that came up a few times in the chat is, to rephrase slightly, like, is there ever a point at which there is too much deliberation? And how do we balance kind of the want for really good, sophisticated forums for deliberation with what some people might argue is like a human instinct to delegate decision making and to make things cognitively less burdensome for them, to ease participation through delegation. Claudia and Sammy and anyone else really, is that something that you're thinking about when you're trying to put the deliberative muscles up against other democratic muscles? How should we be thinking about that?
I'm happy to jump in first, and then Sammy might come in. And at some point, Eugene might jump back at some point for other things too. But I think it's a good question. It's one that comes up in various guises in all sorts of conversations whenever deliberation comes up. I think there's multiple aspects to that question because I think part of it relates to like that. You mentioned like the human instinct to want to like delegate decision making sometimes. And I think there is the acknowledgement of the point we can't be involved in all decisions on everything all the time. But that's also part of the reason why like the other principle that often gets discussed with deliberation when we're talking about this is sortition, meaning the random selection of decision makers. And it's not about everyone trying to be involved in everything all the time, which I think is one of my personal criticisms of like some of the initiatives that are so focused on trying to just maximize as many people in everything, kind of assuming also people either want to or could be participating in everything always, versus creating the conditions that, okay, on like sometimes it will be you who gets involved, but when you are involved, it's going to be in a context that's structured in a way that enables everyone in that process to really have access to the same information, that everyone can be heard, that you're able to like be with that friction, go to the rough ground, and to like not want to escape that. Like Mauricio, you were saying now too, that there's a temptation sometimes that, it could be faster, it could be cheaper, it would be easier if we didn't have that. But actually, like, I would argue that that's one of like the whole points that make this process actually valuable, but also really like meaningful and transformative for people who are involved in it. So I think there's a risk if we start to try and remove all those elements. And so I think I'm thinking about it in that wider way of like, not everyone can't be involved in everything, but we should create those moments that we're rotating power and taking turns in those positions of having processes that are robust, but also like are therefore legitimate and trustworthy. Like if we want to trust the decisions that are coming off the back of it, like that's also one of the kind of common sense test questions of like what needs to be as part of that design for us to trust it. And I think the statistics actually that Mauricio's cited from the OECD are also relevant in this context too. So I don't know if Sammy, you wanted to kind of add anything else or to that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump into the second part of Andrew's question, which is around how to compare, the civic capacity, the civic muscle, deliberative muscle building, um, like democratic virtue, how to think about that in relation to the democratic virtues and qualities that we care about. So I know there you'd have things like inclusion, considered judgment, transparency, the ability of processes to be institutionally feasible. So there are all these kind of democratic goods and virtues and qualities that we care about. And I suppose something that we're trying to do in the paper is almost like um, provide an offset to the way I think a lot of the AI focus has been around the institutional feasibility dimension. So reducing cost and making those dimensions easier to start to integrate. But actually, there are all these other things, all these other democratic virtues that we should care about. And we look quite narrowly here into the civic muscle building one. I think there's maybe good reasons to think that this would track with some of the other muscles, but I think a next step for exploring this would be to unpack those different dimensions further. And ultimately, the main point here is that maintaining a norm of deliberative muscle building seems like something that should be maintained and defended.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on the point of dispersing power, there's a really interesting question in the Q&A about like quote unquote vendor lock-in and what happens when a government or another entity that is running a deliberation goes through this very intense procurement process, and then it is kind of reliant on one deliberative technology for the foreseeable future after that. Maggie, I know that you've done some thinking and some work around interoperability between different deliberative tech tools. Can you speak to that maybe and what you see as like the greatest opportunities to try to bring together different tools that are specializing in different parts of the deliberative process?
For sure. And I think there's folks on here from Crown Shy as well in the group. So excited to have you all here. So part of what enabled the work in New York, yeah, there's Stuart. Part of what enabled the work in New York was a small grant that we got from MetaGov for interoperability. And what it did is it brought together a bunch of civic technologists that were developing open source tools to say, okay, let's come together and try to find ways that we can interoperate with one another. And this is kind of responding to some calls that are going out in the civic tech space and democratic space generally around having democratic ecosystems. So rather than locking into there's one way to practice democracy, there are many ways and many different kinds of tools that we can use. And some that can plug into one another and kind of feed one another in this deliberative cycle and deliberative process. And so I know like Liz Berry at MetaGov has been doing a lot of thinking on that. Stuart and I just published a paper recently at the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference, also with Anaki, another author and kind of person in this space, academic in this space. And in that work, what we had done is we'd spent some time working with some members of that cohort to say, let's develop a kind of a emergent and more inductive data infrastructure or data structure that says, okay, this is what we would need in order for these different kinds of tools to work together. So one might be, this is how we collect voice from one process. This is how we process voice is like maybe another tool. So for example, we might have a poll list, we might have a talk to the city, we might have a something else that people bring together. And what this allows is for folks, and especially those that are innovating or exploring or trying to experiment in cities or wherever, to say we don't have to lock into one kind of tool and one kind of infrastructure only and one kind of democratic practice only, but rather let's experiment and bring in different things for different kinds of contexts, for different kinds of questions. And make that more easy and accessible. There's still a lot of implications around procurement that, of course, are like challenges and barriers to that and that process that you were talking about here. But I think that pursuit of interoperability and open sourcing and being able to connect these civic technologies allow us to experiment and play in this space a little bit more and give folks the ability to do that. And so I'm a big fan of that kind of movement within the space and was grateful to be able to play and contribute in that area. And to say, I think Crown Shy is like really diving into that by exploring adapters between tools. So a light flag on that front.
Yeah, thanks. There's another question, and maybe you were getting at this already, Mauricio, about the risk of bias of large language models, and how we should be trying to contextualize them or embed them in broader democratic infrastructure to try to be able to point out where biases may emerge, especially in things like summarization and language translation and things like this. Either Lisa or Mauricio. Is there something else you can add to flesh this out for folks that are concerned with the risk of bias in AI integration? Or is this just something that, we should always be attuned to, and therefore the AI should always be subordinate to human oversight and judgment or whatever else? I'm personally of the opinion that maybe there's some sort of coevolution here because human decision makers are hugely biased as well. And so I'm curious if there's actually a use case in which AI, rather than delegating decisions to AI, can be used as a way to point out biases and human synthesis or human explanations of different phenomena or so on. But I'm curious what you both think.
I can come in just briefly. I think what I would say here is definitely what you mentioned, Andrew, is something to be aware of when you go into deliberative processes, and especially multilingual deliberative processes, that bias does exist, just even on the level of quality in different languages beyond English, I mean, beyond English as a starter, but then like if you're, I mean, Mozilla Foundation has done a lot of work with the Common Voice project on what's called resource languages and enabling building voice language data sets to particularly like specifically get at this problem to have better quality data sets so that you don't have this problem that when you interact with the same technology in your own language, that you get a much less reliable result. So there are things that, be aware of it in deliberative processes, but also it speaks to the larger thing that Mauricio was talking about, which is like kind of concentration of power um and like production of these technologies and how we should push for more distribution and more, creation of data sets that address that bias. So that's what I would say. I don't know, Mauricio, if you have things to add.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with. I don't think neutrality exists. I hard see something being fully neutral or fully. I think it's part of, you know, I guess human. We're all a little bit biased, no? And the point is that we're not unfair, I guess, especially in this type of processes. So, the problem is more than AI has been proven to be even more biased than we are, and especially biased towards specific groups of people, minorities, traditional excluded people, because who codes who works in the tools, but also the data that is being served to train them. So I think to answer your question, Andrew, I don't. I hope in the future we come to improve and to reach a level of AI development where biases are lower because we work collectively to feed the models with data that are maybe more representative and that we include more representative group of people in the AI development field. So I think it's not the tool which should our focus, it's rather how we develop and how we govern and how we use the tools. And then maybe at that point, we could be less worried about the biases of AI, I think.
Yeah, it's so true. We so often talk about AI as something that just like exists as such, as opposed to something that is developed through a process, right? And a very long and an intensive one at that. Um, I want to go back. There's a super interesting question in the chat, and it picks up on something you were saying, Sammy, earlier about deliberation being one of several democratic virtues, and how we think about the interaction between them. So this question in particular is arguing that dialogue and deliberation they access maybe our system two thinking, which uses rationality and some sort of deeper interaction with language and whatever else. And this person was wondering whether, in your view, there's also a place in democratic politics for an arguably more inclusive, although flawed, kind of system one thinking that is more attuned to direct participation or an exercise of feelings that can't be cleanly and clearly articulated through words. And so I'm wondering whether you think like there is an interaction to be had there, or if there are moments for mass democracy to emerge while being embedded in the context of broader deliberation.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Yeah, I think my perspective on this is definitely there's space for that kind of thing within a democratic system. We need protests, we need the kind of associational work. I loved what Maggie was talking about earlier. That is I thought that was a real through thread actually for what the other three speakers were all talking about. Not just democratic infrastructure as assemblies or similarly related processes, but embedding these within, the wider democratic culture and infrastructure. So yeah, I definitely think there's a place for that. And to be honest, what I feel most excited about almost about what technology can do for like the micro or even for like deliberative assemblies is I think it can help with proliferating and pluralizing these practices so they become more widespread. This comes with the different risks, that talk about discussion there about bias was really insightful. But it also enables us to do more and operate in different ways. And I think that's also exciting to think about how it can support these other types of practices within beyond assemblies as well.
So I'm realizing that not everyone may have the same conception of what an AI-enabled deliberation might actually look like. When people think about AI, they think about summarization, synthesis, things like that. Claudia, can you maybe like outline for us a vision of what democracy might look like when we have these enhanced deliberative processes? Like, what role is AI playing, not merely in summarizing, but actually in enabling individuals to engage in kind of like a deeper, more reflective kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, especially since I'm also assuming not everyone has had a chance to actually read the full paper yet, where we also don't go into all those details. Actually, one of the next ideas we have is probably to flesh out a few kind of like process design options that would show like different ways and at different stages and with different kinds of tools. Like to the point earlier too, we don't think there's just one tool that would ever be like some mega tool that does it all. It is about the interoperability of these things. And so, I mean, we were also kind of looking at this largely through a lens of processes that are taking place like synchronously and with like direct personal contact. So in person could also be like in a setting like we are now, but less so like asynchronous text-based only. Like we feel like some of the things that might be in that space that get called deliberation, actually, when you put it up against the definition of deliberation, are often not very deliberative at all. So we're really talking about processes that have some of those elements in place. So how might you use AI in such a process? So I think one example that was already elaborated on, so I won't go into details, is that you could use the tool developed by Plural Reality around self-reflection before you even enter a process, that it can help you pose questions to you that might help you have a better sense of what your values are in relation to the topic you're about to be deliberating on with other people before you enter the room. But another way that that tool could be used within a deliberative process, which Shutaro Aoyama explained to me as how they've used it also in deliberative processes in Japan, is also during the assembly process. So one example, for instance, is like there might be like one expert presenter or a few expert presentations, and before anybody asks any questions of them or starts discussing what they think or the questions they might have, they might use the tool again, that it might be prompting them to think about, what did you think? What questions did you have? Like what it brings up for them. And then the collective responses around a small table will be shared with a small group. So it helps also to overcome a different kind of problem where a discussion might end up kind of getting led or dominated by the first person who speaks and shares their view, or the shy person who doesn't quite feel confident enough to even say anything, and that view might not come in at all. So actually by doing that process first, people both first come to like have a moment to think through what they think, but they also create a more equal starting point for a conversation collectively about those things. Another example might be, like, for instance, we've been using the tool DemBrain, which Yoram co-founded, and it's unfortunate he couldn't be here. You probably could speak to this better, but we've been using it, for example, in a citizens' assembly in Esch, where the tool has been used to record the different small group conversations. In this context, it also happened to be multilingual. There have been other contexts that are not necessarily the case, but basically it means that at the end of those conversations, there's different functionalities of what can happen. One is that all of the facilitators will get a summary that is generated by AI and everyone recognizes is imperfect, but in their language right after things happen. So they're able to like confer and check in with one another, both like with the personal like bias and perspective, but also with like a more comprehensive summary. Those summaries will also be kind of verified and double checked with the people at the group before they might be shared out with everybody else. But it was one of the things that enabled people in this multilingual setting to like still deliberate in their different languages, but deliberate together in a way that like people often get totally separated, or like you might have live interpretation that slows things down in some ways, which also has other benefits. But in any case, just to say that that's like one of the examples, and I shared a link to a paper that discusses that in a little bit more depth. But I might also share just one example of something that came up in a recent meeting with the DelibTech network that involves a mix of technologists and practitioners. And one of the practitioners was sharing like, what is a red line of when you might not use it? And it might feel intuitive though to be using it, because I think that's equally instructive for people trying to imagine this. And that was talking about like the point in a process where like people will have raised and surfaced many different ideas that then need to get clustered together into some forms of like groups or categories. And it would be very tempting to think that, oh, that's like a task that AI would be great at. And some have tested this and have found that when you present back AI generated clusters of like people's ideas, the energy totally dissipates from the room, and people's motivation, sense of ownership over what they've done has also gone. Whereas actually that process also of doing the clustering themselves both clarifies ambiguities that initially came up, like shows like differences people might have had of understanding something, gets them to be more precise, and also like people really actually come to internalize like what they've understood about things. So there's like a value in those things that like again those are various muscles get touched upon, but those are just a few like very concrete tangible examples. I could say there are more in the paper if you want to go into them, but I'm also conscious of time.
Can I also
Yeah, I
just,
mean it's always sorry, Eugene, are you jamming in here?
yeah, I just wanted to jump in. Sorry, I'm off camera
Please.
because of kids.
Mhm.
But I just wanted to add 3 points to the question that you framed, Andrew. And there may be just more observations of us, all operating in this field, either, with academic hats on, with operational, like practitioner hats on. But deliberation is a pretty big tent, is like my first observation. I think there's a lot of people who say, oh, that's not deliberation, that's like participatory democracy or this. Like there's people start splitting hairs very quickly, and there's kind of a, oh, let's just all call this deliberation. And there's a lot of processes that get included in that. So kind of a lot of processes is what we're talking about when oftentimes people say deliberation. That's like point number one, or observation number one. Observation two is that democracy is like very plural in nature. So like the objectives that we go for are very different depending on like the people and processes that are trying to adopt these technologies. So like some people are like, hey, I need this to lend really like political legitimacy to this process that I'm doing. Or other people are saying, I just need to know what the most efficient policy recommendation here is. And so these things get used in different pluralistic contexts, and I think that's also like really important to like as an observation, uh, because the third thing that I'll say is that I think the big shift from like these like very theoretical things of Habermas and Rawls, like things that we've read in school, to this like the use of AI in deliberation, quote unquote, is that this becomes a socio-technical process. And that's like a fancy way of saying the people and processes affect how the technology is seen and how the AI is like seen and construed. And then vice versa, like the technology, like people's fears of AI actually, if you're in a different part of non-San Francisco area, like that actually might affect how you use the people and the processes are shaped around this technology. And I think that's like probably my third observation of like this is a socio-technical process. And we're talking about muscles here as like, hey, like let's not forget about let's not just AIify everything is sort of the gist of the paper. And let's be cognizant of how we build in AI. And I think it's because of those three observations all really coming together. Like, whoa, there's a lot of different deliberative things. There's a lot of plural objectives that we're going for, and there's a lot of different contexts. So it begs the question of like, how do we design carefully in the context and the processes and the people that we're serving? And that might be very manual, very non-scalable. Maybe there's some pattern matching out there that we can do, but it's a hard problem. And I think we just have to really get back to like each of these individual cases and build up that pattern matching as a field, as opposed to let's, do a blanket like techno solutionist thing here, or like vice versa. Let's just co-design and co-create everything. I think that might also be the wrong thing too. But I think there's still a lot of experimentation and designing that's necessary here. Thanks for letting me put in.
No, that was wonderful and incredibly well said. I was thinking on the friction slide and also throughout the paper that some people reading this might be surprised by calls for more friction because when people think about existing democratic institutions, they are really frictionful, right? And there are many what should be called counter majoritarian measures to precisely preclude moments of democratic will being channeled through, for instance, like the building of affordable housing and whatever else, right? And so to Eugene's point, like there are probably different moments for different exercises of democracy to be had, but we don't want all of them to just be smoothed over with integration of emerging technology is precisely the point. So we only have 7 minutes left here, and we have six people sitting on our panel. So I was wondering maybe we could do a final around the horn, perhaps. There are a bunch of questions about use cases and examples that folks can research and read about after the call, and also a really nice question about where to look for leadership around these topics. Is this something that should be developed among technologists or civil society or governments or all of the above? And so I was hoping we could maybe like go around and each person says an example of a democratic innovation that's playing out that really excites you and that you think stimulates these democratic and deliberative muscles in productive ways. Uh, I'm open to letting people popcorn in, and if not, I will just call on Lisa maybe to start.
Yeah, well, I was gonna kind of just for the examples I had, we just launched yesterday, so I'm gonna list the projects of and good to know that also Kamharle is on the call. So that's one. Harmonica is another kind of technology within the MetaGov grant. We of course have Maggie here from Convoca. And the project that I talked about from Plural Reality, which I continue to have a hard time pronouncing, but by Kukagi, I believe. And then what was the other part of the question, Andrew? Sorry.
I think that's great. Just trying to give everyone a bit more fodder to be able to continue the
Oh,
conversation and learning afterward.
it was about leadership. And actually, I
Mhm.
haven't, I have a concrete answer to that. And like, frankly, I would say look to Democracy Next. I think they're really at the forefront of this work in terms of combining research and pragmatism and lived experience. And also, like I said, within the paper, there's lots of examples of different initiatives, and there's also the list of reviewers. So I'm sure if you look at around there, that's like a list of leaders at the forefront of the space.
Thanks. Maybe to Maggie.
Sure, not to piggyback and but I was also thinking DevNext is a great example. And I think part of it is, I think throughout this, and I think Eugene pulled this out, that there's something about research and experimentation that I think is really, can be really valuable here, like testing and trying things out and seeing what might be surprising around, oh, the clustering is actually a really important muscle. So I find research really valuable. I'm coming from that perspective, but I think that is great. And then also to have a caveat to that, I think a great deal of research and experimenting and play is also done outside of academia, like on the ground, these practitioners that are really trying things out and kind of documenting those learnings. So yeah, I think DemNext does a great job of I think this paper is a great example of highlighting all of those examples and experimentations. And yeah, I think practitioners on the ground are also doing a ton of really rich learning, and I think can be a great resource to learn from. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. Over to you, Mauricio.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I mean, before answering your question, I think just to close also, I think, I mean, this is, I remember when we started talking about civic tech like 10, 12 years ago, and the same question always pops like, is this wave of technology gonna revolutionize democracy? And here we are. So I think we also need to be a little bit also cautious on the investments, both social, economic, and technological we put to AI. At the end, technology is a means to an end, right? And we need to change rather the political and system. That's what it needs to be changed. And then I think we can be super creative on how to use technology to improve it, to make it better, faster, better, I don't know, more user friendly, and everything we want. And so on tools, I mean, honestly, there are so many. I was just trying to go through the chat. There's so many. So I think it's more interesting, in my opinion, to look at the cases, like how do we use those tools? I was talking about like in France, one use of generative AI to help the people beyond the assembly understand the assembly, like the deliberations, the results. I think there are many good tools and case studies, and I will refer to the Civic Tech Field Guide. I think that's a very good repository. But I think it's more on the cases and how we use. And I mean I insist. I think human plus AI is the right method or the right combination until AI it's properly developed. And on leadership, again, of course, shout out to them next, but also I think there are many and maybe that we need to promote it and give them more support. Many leaders in the global south, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia that should be also be part of this conversation. So very thank you for the invitation and happy to continue this chat.
Thanks so much. Sammy, Claudia, and Eugene as well. I realize we're just a minute away here, but I want to give you the closing words.
Yeah, of course. I'll say something really quickly. I definitely share Mauricio's point there around it, focusing around use cases and what Maggie was saying around building more rigorous metrics. We can actually do some comparative analysis of these different technologies as they're used. And so, yeah, there's been lots of amazing organizations and things mentioned. But something I would maybe really quickly add was that some people may know that I actually carried out a survey of citizen assembly practitioners around their uses and perceptions of AI. So I just maybe a couple really quick headlines. One was that actually the main advantage that practitioners perceived at around 70% or something was enabling more inclusive and meaningful engagement, which I thought was quite interesting because a lot of the focus has obviously been around scalability and efficiency, but the actual mainly perceived one was maybe more aligned with what we're talking about here. And then the main risk perceived was around AI bias and inaccuracies. And then the third main risk was actually around undermining skill building and deliberative muscles, as we've explored in this paper. So there's obviously a lot of really important insights, as I can't remember who said exactly, but the practitioners have, and trying to draw that out. And I'm looking forward to trying to map out and write up these findings for the community over the next few weeks and months.
I see that Eugene has no comment. We are at time, so I'm not going to I spoke a lot in this meeting. I shared lots of cases. So, well, thank you, Andrew. Also, as Lisa said, the list of the reviewers, the DelibTech network, the Civic Tech Field Guide has lots of great examples. Thank you. These amazing speakers are also leaders in the field. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to Andrew. Thanks to everyone who joined for your amazing questions and contributions. This was, as always, super rich, and we're looking forward to continuing these conversations. So thanks, everyone. Until next time.
Thanks.